Now, having completed rendering the basic DOM elements and diffing the DOM element, let us now get into details of functional component and how it can be rendered by using our tiny React library. Okay, before beginning to create our functional component, let us comment out the render that is not required in here. So I'll comment out both this render. Okay, now let us kind of create the simplest functional component. So I'll create a new functional component called heart. Okay, that doesn't take up parameters, and this will simply render a span with an heart HTML entity, and we are done. Okay, so this is a simple form of a functional component. Now this can also be written as shown below, function heart, and return span hearts. So both of these are same. Okay, so for now I'll just comment out this bigger version of the function and use the ES6 concise function notation, which is the arrow function syntax. Okay, but both of this thing will work out. Now once I have this functional component, I would like to render this out, right? So I'll call tiny react dot render. Okay, I'll say heart. Okay, and maybe I can self close the tag directly, and let's render it onto the root element. Okay, so this is the way we call the functional component. Now one thing to note here is, as in React, any custom component like functional component or a stateful component should start with an uppercase, right? So we have this H starting with uppercase, and any built-in elements that you typically write, that typically start with the lowercase letter. This is just a convention that React follows, so we'll follow the same convention in here. Now at this point in time, if you take a look at the dom.js file in here, we are not dealing with functions anywhere, right? We're only dealing with the native DOM elements. So if I go back to the browser and do a refresh, okay, you'll see nothing is happening in here. Maybe there's a console error, right? And the error is failed to execute create element and document. The tag name provided heart is not a valid name. Okay, now our code doesn't understand this heart tag name that we just provided, right? This is where now we need to modify our diff function to take care of this. Now before getting into the code of how to render this functional component, let's log this to the console and see the structure of this virtual DOM. So console dot log, I'll just render out the heart component. Okay, our heart JSX that is kind of created, right? So once I do this and go back to the browser and do a refresh, let's see whether we get anything in here. Okay, now see, we actually get type in here, right? Call function heart. Okay, but the problem here is again the same thing that we had, that the tag name provided is not valid, kind of, right? So this is the right time to kind of go and implement the required feature to support functional component. So let's go back to the code, open up the dom.js file and locate the diff function. Now here we have a scenario where if there are no old DOM, we just mount the element, otherwise we do the diff, right? Now just below this first if statement, I write an else if. Okay, this is where we are checking for functional component, and the condition for that is if type of vdom.type, if it's a function. Okay, so this is the case. So we'll write a helper method called diff component. We have to write this function diff component, and we'll pass in the vdom, the old component. We don't have anything at this point in time since we haven't yet looked into the stateful component, so I'll pass it as null. Okay, the container and the old DOM. Okay, now we have to implement this diff component method or function. Let us now take a look at the diff component method. So the diff component method receives the new virtual DOM, the old component which is null at this point in time, the container and the DOM element, and then we check for the old component. So if there are no old component, that means we just simply need to mount the element, right? So we again call the mount element function, passing in the new virtual element, the container and the DOM element. Now the code to kind of actually create an instance of the functional component will be written in the mount element function. Let us now make the necessary code change in the mount element function. Now by default the mount element was only treating the native DOM element, so we were returning a simple node from in here. Now we have to put an if condition in here and check whether the vdom is of type function. If yes, then we have to kind of do some different activity, load up the functional component. Otherwise we have to load the mount simple node, right? So this is the code base. So what we are doing in here in the mount element is we are checking for the type of the vdom, and if it is function, we are calling a method called mount component, passing in the vdom, the container, and the old DOM. Otherwise we are simply doing what we were doing earlier. We are invoking the mount simple node function in here. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at the mount component method. We'll also write a couple of helper functions to deal with this function check. Now one thing to note is that as we implement stateful functions at a later point in time, both the functional component as well as the stateful component, they have the type of function. Okay, so that's a thing to remember. So if type is function, that could be a functional component or that could be a stateful component as well. So we have to deal with both the cases later on. Okay, let me first write a couple of helper functions to test whether it's a functional component or a stateful component. So the first helper method is a method called isFunction that takes in an object and then it returns true or false depending on whether the function or the object is of type function or not. Okay, this simply tests for the type of function here. Now once I have this function in here, instead of doing this type of vdom.function now, I could simply do if isFunction vdom. This kind of make the code much more readable. Now the second helper function that I will add in here is a function called as isFunctional component. Now what this does is it takes in a vnode or a vdom, okay, and it grabs the type from the parameter and then it returns true or false depending on if it's a function, and if it's a function, okay, it does not have a render method. Now why this check, right? Because a functional component does not have a render method. They simply return the virtual DOM, right? But a stateful component could have a render method, or in fact a stateful component need to have a render method. So this is the check that we are doing here to test whether this is a functional component or a stateful component. Now let us implement the mount component function in a step-by-step manner. Okay, so I'll put in the function signature in here and start filling in the code. Now this mount component will initialize some variable first. Okay, so it will create a next vdom, a component, and a new DOM element which is set to null initially. Okay, because when we are mounting a component, a new vdom will be generated. Now then we have to check whether the vdom that we have is a functional component or not. Okay, so kind of that's quite an easy check to do kind of. So maybe I could come back in here and put the code here first. Okay, so what we are doing here is we are checking whether the vdom that is being passed is a functional component or not, and if yes, we are calling a helper function called build functional component that will return a new vdom, and we store the return value into the variable next vdom. Okay, now what is this build functional component looks like? Again, it's kind of a very simple function. It will just call the function. Okay, so here is the build functional component helper method. Now this functional component is simply taking the vnode. Now ignore the context for a moment, we are not using it at this point in time, and once it has the vnode, it will grab the type and invoke it directly because this is of type function, right? This is how you generate the new vdom from a functional component. Okay, now once you have this information in here, let's continue on the code. Now once the new vdom is available, it may be available, it may not be available depending on this condition that we are doing in here. Okay, what we have to do is to recursively call mount component or mount element as applicable, because see, remember that this React, right, everything is like a tree structure, right? So every node could have some children, and then once you process the parent element, you have to loop through the child elements and do the diff as well, right? So here what we are doing again is, if there is this next vdom available, and if it is a function, we call the mount component again, okay, passing in the new vdom that we just created, the container and the old DOM element. Now if this new vdom that is created is not a function, then we simply call the mount element method or function, passing in the new vdom, the container and the old element, and then we return the new DOM element from here. Okay, this is the code for the mount component. Now once I save this information and go back to the browser and do a refresh, you should see the functional component rendering correctly on the screen, right? There's a small heart that is being rendered on the screen in here, right? So this successfully shows that the functional component is rendered. I could kind of show you by debugging this, right? So maybe I'll go to the sources here in the Google Developer Toolbox and then open up the dom.js file. And now I'll kind of put a break point in this diff method here within the render method here. And now if I do a refresh, okay, the breakpoint will stop at this diff method in here. So okay, now the breakpoint is available, right? Now if you observe the VDOM, you will see the VDOM's type is a function, right? That you can see in here. Now if I press F11, I'll go into the diff in here, right? So we are grabbing the old VDOM in here. And we are checking whether there is old DOM or not. Now in this case, since we don't have any other DOM element, this old DOM element is null and it will go to the mount element function. Now we were hoping kind of this should go to the diff component function, right? But again, this is a good test case, right? Because we could ensure that even our functional component is rendering during the first render cycle as well. Now we are taking care of the component diffing within the mount element, right? As you remember the code. Now, if I press F11, I'll go into the mount element. Now within the mount element, this VDOM type will be function. So it will invoke the mount component function, and now if I press F11 again, it will go to the mount component function, and if I press F10 here, it will go to the is functional component check, which will return true, and this will go to the build functional component method wherein we are passing in the VDOM. And if I press F11, I will be within this build functional component. And in here, we're actually calling vnode.type. Now this type is a function, and giving this opening and closing pair of parentheses will invoke the function, right? So if I press F11 again, we'll go to the actual function invocation here within the todo app.js file. And then if I press F10, I will be back to the dom.js file, and from in here we are and the return value of this will be kind of stored within the new DOM element. Okay, and we are returning from in here. Okay, now once this process is completed, you will see the heart being rendered onto the screen. Okay, so this is how the functional component is mounted. Now our scenario will work both in the initial mount as well as the mounting that happens during the diffing or reconciliation phase. Let us now see how to pass props to the functional component. So now what I'll do is I'll change this heart component that we have in here and make it to take props as well. So I'll come back in here and pass the parameter props to this function. Okay, and then right within this span in here, I'll set the style to props.style that we are passing in here. Okay, so this is a simple implementation of a function that taking in the props, and in this case we are kind of passing in the style as the props value and setting back the style to the span element in here. Now once I do this in here, I could come back to the render method here, and in here I could pass a prop and I'll set the say color to red. Okay, I hope this should kind of work in here. Okay, now if I save this and come back to the browser and do a refresh, nothing will happen because we are not yet dealing with props within the functional component. Okay, and there seems to be some error, I guess. Okay, so my machine was a bit slow, so the error is cannot read the property style of undefined. Now the reason that we are getting this error is because if you take a look at the code in here, right, so we are passing in the props and this function body is expecting this props parameter. But then if you take a look at our implementation of the functional component, so let me go back to the code which is build functional component. We are invoking the component here, but then we are not passing in the props. Okay, and this is why the props is undefined in the function body, right? Now let's fix this, right? The fix is kind of very quick. So what I can do in here is I could come back in here and say grab the virtual node that we have and pass on the props, and if there are no props, I could simply pass in an empty object literal as well. Okay, and this should fix the issue. Now once I save this and go back to the browser and do a refresh, Okay, you will see the color of this little heart getting changed in here, right? Because we pass in the props for this.